It is a grave indictment on this international community that we can spend so much money on war. And in fact, trillions are being spent on war, but we cannot support action that needs to be taken to meet the basic need of billions of people in the world.
Could any leader worldwide openly discuss the injustices done by the West against their nation? While many powerful nations might falter, African leaders stand out. At the recent United Nations General Assembly, African leaders fearlessly voiced their grievances, articulating their frustrations without hesitation. Moreover, they didn't stop at mere complaints. They also proposed tangible solutions to rectify these issues. The question remains, will their impassioned words receive due consideration? Let's find out.
We've witnessed it firsthand, over and over again, that the big powers of the United Nations might be preaching democracy, fairness, and justice around the world, but are happy to practice the opposite here at the United Nations, prioritizing parochial interests over those of humanity.
Recently, African leaders have taken the stage at the United Nations General Assembly (UNGA) with forceful and passionate speeches that challenge global power dynamics and advocate for the continent's interests. These addresses are not merely ceremonial, but critical interventions in international discourse. For instance, during the latest UNGA session, Malawian President Lazarus Chakwera's statement, "While trillions are spent on war, billions of people suffer from unmet basic needs," resonated deeply, highlighting the stark global inequalities. These speeches highlight pressing issues such as global inequities, historical injustices, and the urgent need for inclusive international institutions. Leaders from Africa are vocal about the contradictions in the policies of major powers, who often preach democracy and justice but fail to practice these principles. They call for genuine partnerships over charity, sustainable development, debt relief, and significant reforms in global governance structures. Let's discuss their stance one by one. What did the leader have to say about partnership and debt relief? African leaders have consistently emphasized the importance of genuine partnerships over charity in their speeches at the United Nations General Assembly (UNGA). This theme is particularly poignant in the continent's struggle with unsustainable debt. As African nations grapple with the economic fallout from the COVID-19 pandemic and ongoing development challenges, the call for equitable financial practices and debt relief has grown louder and more urgent.
We as Africa have come to the world not to ask for alms, charity, or handouts, but to work with the rest of the global community to give every human being in this world a decent chance of security and prosperity by taking necessary actions, mobilizing adequate resources for investment, confronting security challenges, and resolving conflict as we all make our contribution to global prosperity.
African leaders argue that the continent needs fair partnerships rather than charity or handouts. They stress that Africa is not looking for pity, but a seat at the table where global economic decisions are made. Ghanaian President Nana Akufo-Addo articulated this stance clearly in his recent UNGA address, stating, "We are not here to beg for aid. We are here to demand fair treatment and equal opportunities to participate in the global economy." This perspective reflects a broader desire for respect and equity in international relations. African nations want to be seen and treated as equal partners capable of contributing to and benefiting from global economic growth. This approach involves collaboration on projects that foster mutual growth, such as infrastructure development, technological innovation, and sustainable energy projects. African leaders highlight that such partnerships can lead to shared prosperity and stability, benefiting Africa and the global community. One of the most pressing issues for African nations is the burden of unsustainable debt. Many countries on the continent are trapped in a cycle of debt that hinders their development and exacerbates poverty. Malawian President Lazarus Chakwera, in his recent address, emphasized the gravity of the situation by stating, "The debts we carry are not just numbers, they are barriers to our people's hopes and dreams." The call for debt cancellation is not new, but it has gained renewed urgency amid the global economic downturn caused by the pandemic. African leaders argue that debt relief is crucial for economic recovery and sustainable development. They point out that the resources currently used to service debt could be redirected towards critical areas such as healthcare, education, and infrastructure, which are essential for long-term growth. In the past, Malawi's President Chakwera has been particularly vocal about the need for debt relief. He highlighted the unsustainable debt burden on least developed countries, LDCs, like Malawi, where debt repayments consume significant portions of national budgets. How can we talk of development when so much of our resources are siphoned off to service debts? He asked rhetorically at the UNGA.
Wherever we look, and in whichever area of our lives to which we turn our attention, there is unhappiness, distrust, and loss of confidence, structures that have guided the governance of the world since the end of the Second World War, nearly 8 decades ago. Mr. President, the theme chosen for this meeting is rebuilding trust and reigniting global solidarity, accelerating action on the 2030 Agenda and its sustainable development goals towards peace, prosperity, progress, and sustainability for all. The choice of the theme implies that there's general acknowledgement that things are not what they ought to be in our world. The mutual trust among nations that is required to ensure harmony has considerably diminished. The cohesion that we need to build the peace and prosperity of our societies is disintegrating and nearing Cold War lows. The deliberate peddling of blatant untruths has become acceptable. This organization, the United Nations, under whose auspices we, the nations of the world, are gathered for the annual review of the world, was established in the belief our common humanity would be the overriding consideration in dealing with the problems that would invariably arise when we deal with one another.
Here is what another leader has to say.
All the peoples represented here in this United Nations had their origins in Africa. In Africa, they developed the tools and capabilities to spread across the world and achieved remarkable feats of development and progress. And all this was due to the skills and the talent that originated from the African continent. Despite its history, despite the legacy of exploitation, colonialism, and subjugation, despite the ongoing challenge of conflict and instability, Africa is determined and ready to regain its position as a site of human progress. The era of African development has arrived.
Similarly, Zambia's President Hakainde Hichilema has stressed the detrimental impact of high debt levels on his country's economic stability. He called for a comprehensive approach to debt relief that includes not only the suspension of debt repayments, but also the restructuring and, in some cases, outright cancellation of debt. This approach, he argued, would provide a much-needed reprieve and create a fiscal space for development initiatives. But why is this issue highlighted? Debt relief is closely linked to broader global economic justice and sustainable development issues. African leaders argue that the current global financial system is skewed in favor of wealthy nations, often to the detriment of developing countries. They advocate for a reformed financial architecture that is fair, transparent, and supportive of development goals. For instance, African leaders have proposed establishing a global debt workout mechanism under the auspices of the United Nations. Such a mechanism would provide a structured and fair process for addressing sovereign debt crises, ensuring that all stakeholders, including creditors and debtor nations, have a say in the negotiations. And what about the Partnership for Development? In addition to debt relief, African leaders call for stronger partnerships to support development goals. These partnerships should be based on mutual respect and benefit and focus on infrastructure development, education, healthcare, and technology. By investing in these areas, Africa can achieve sustainable development and contribute to global prosperity. Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. African leaders have highlighted the continent's green growth and sustainable development potential. They argue that Africa, with its vast natural resources and young population, is well positioned to lead in areas such as renewable energy and sustainable agriculture. However, realizing this potential requires significant investment and collaboration with international partners. The leader also talked about the reforms of international instruction. But how important is that? African leaders have long advocated for the reform of international institutions to better reflect the realities of the 21st century and address the needs of all nations, particularly those in the global south. This call for reform is rooted in a deep-seated frustration with the existing structures of global governance, which are often seen as outdated, undemocratic, and biased towards the interests of the most powerful nations. In their recent speeches at the United Nations General Assembly, African leaders have once again highlighted the urgent need for reform and put forward concrete proposals to make international institutions more inclusive, representative, and responsive to the needs of all member states. One of the key demands of African leaders is for international institutions to be more inclusive and representative of the diverse voices and interests of the global community. They argue that the current structures of organizations such as the United Nations Security Council are outdated and do not adequately reflect the geopolitical realities of the 21st century. For instance, the UNSC, with its 5 permanent members and veto power, is often criticized for being unrepresentative and undemocratic, giving disproportionate influence to a handful of powerful nations at the expense of the rest of the world. African leaders have called for urgent reforms to the UNSC to address these shortcomings and ensure that the Council is more reflective of the current distribution of power and influence in the world. They advocate for expanding the Council's membership to include more permanent and non-permanent seats, emphasizing increasing representation for African and other developing countries. This would make the UNSC more inclusive and enhance its legitimacy and effectiveness in addressing global peace and security challenges. Do more African leaders want this? The push for greater African representation in international institutions has been a consistent theme in recent UNGA speeches by African leaders. They argue that Africa, the world's second largest and most populous continent, deserves a greater voice and seat in global decision-making. This includes representation in the UNSC and other key bodies such as the International Monetary Fund (IMF), the World Bank, and the World Trade Organization (WTO). African leaders have proposed specific measures to increase African representation in these institutions, including allocating more seats on their governing boards and executive committees to African countries, and appointing more Africans to senior leadership positions within these organizations. They argue that greater African representation would not only make these institutions more democratic and legitimate, but also ensure that they consider the perspectives and interests of African nations when making important decisions that affect the continent's development and prosperity. In addition to being more inclusive and representative, African leaders emphasize the importance of international institutions being democratic and accountable to their member states and the global community. They argue that international organizations often operate opaque and undemocratic, with decision-making processes dominated by a small group of powerful nations and special interests. This undermines the credibility and effectiveness of these institutions and erodes trust in the international system as a whole. African leaders call for reforms to make international institutions more transparent, accountable, and responsive to the needs and concerns of all member states. This includes greater transparency in decision-making processes, increased participation of developing countries in setting the agenda and priorities of international organizations, and mechanisms to hold international institutions accountable for their actions and decisions. Did the leaders talk about the elephant in the room, historical injustices and financial outflows? African leaders have consistently emphasized the importance of addressing historical injustices and illicit financial outflows as critical steps toward achieving justice, equality, and sustainable development on the continent. In their recent addresses at the United Nations General Assembly, they have called attention to the legacy of colonialism, slavery, and exploitation that continues to shape Africa's socio-economic landscape today. Additionally, they have highlighted the significant drain on Africa's resources caused by illicit financial flows, which perpetuate poverty and hinder development efforts. This section explores African leaders' perspectives on these issues and their proposals for redress and reform. The scars of colonialism and the transatlantic slave trade run deep in Africa's collective memory. African leaders contend that the economic and social disparities that exist today are a direct result of centuries of exploitation and oppression by colonial powers. They argue that the wealth and prosperity enjoyed by many Western nations were built on the backs of African labor and resources, often through brutal and exploitative means. African leaders have called for reparations for the historical injustices inflicted upon the continent. They argue that reparations are not merely about financial compensation, but also about acknowledging the wrongs of the past and providing redress for the lasting impact of colonialism and slavery on African societies. This sentiment was echoed by South African President Cyril Ramaphosa in his recent UNGA address when he stated, "Reparations are not charity. They are a debt owed by the global community to Africa for centuries of exploitation and injustice." While reparations remain contentious and complex, African leaders have called for meaningful dialogue and action to address the legacy of historical injustices. They argue that reparations should take various forms, including financial compensation, debt relief, investment in development projects, and initiatives to promote reconciliation and healing. Illicit financial outflows pose a significant challenge to Africa's development and prosperity. African leaders estimate that the continent loses over $88 billion annually due to illicit financial activities such as corruption, tax evasion, money laundering, and illicit trade. These outflows deprive African countries of much-needed resources that could otherwise be used to fund critical infrastructure projects, improve healthcare and education systems, and alleviate poverty. African leaders have called for concerted action to combat illicit financial outflows and recover stolen assets. They argue that tackling corruption and financial crimes requires domestic efforts, international cooperation, and support. They have called on the international community to strengthen anti-corruption measures, enhance financial transparency, and hold individuals and entities accountable for their illicit activities. Furthermore, African leaders have emphasized greater collaboration with financial institutions, regulatory bodies, and law enforcement agencies to trace, freeze, and repatriate stolen assets. They argue that returning stolen assets to their rightful owners, the people of Africa, is a matter of justice and a crucial step towards promoting good governance, accountability, and transparency. The African Union AU has taken significant steps to address the continent's corruption and illicit financial flows. In 2003, the AU adopted the African Union Convention on Preventing and Combating Corruption, which aims to promote transparency, accountability, and integrity in public and private sectors across Africa. The convention includes provisions for asset recovery, mutual legal assistance, and international cooperation in the fight against corruption. Additionally, the AU established the African Union Advisory Board on Corruption AUABC to guide and support member states in implementing anti-corruption measures. The AUABC works closely with national anti-corruption agencies, civil society organizations, and international partners to promote good governance and combat corruption at all levels. The AU has also launched initiatives such as the African Anti-Corruption Day and the African Anti-Corruption Excellence Awards to raise awareness about the detrimental effects of corruption and recognize individuals and organizations that have significantly contributed to the fight against corruption. The issue of historical injustices and illicit financial outflows has far-reaching implications for Africa's development and its relations with the international community. Addressing these challenges is essential for achieving sustainable development, promoting good governance, and fostering inclusive growth on the continent. By highlighting colonialism and slavery's legacy, African leaders seek to promote a deeper understanding of Africa's history and its impact on present-day socio-economic realities. They argue that acknowledging and redressing historical injustices is a moral imperative and a necessary step toward building a more just and equitable world. Similarly, by combating illicit financial outflows, African leaders aim to protect Africa's resources and ensure that they are used for the benefit of its people. They argue that reducing corruption and promoting transparency and accountability are essential for attracting investment, stimulating economic growth, and reducing poverty on the continent. But what do they say about the future apart from mentioning the issue? African leaders increasingly focus on future-oriented development strategies, prioritizing sustainable growth, innovation, and global cooperation. In their recent addresses, they have outlined ambitious plans to harness Africa's potential for green growth, technology-driven innovation, and inclusive development. Moreover, African leaders have emphasized rebuilding global trust and solidarity to address pressing global challenges effectively. African leaders recognize the urgent need to transition to sustainable development models that promote economic growth while preserving the environment and addressing climate change. They argue that Africa's vast natural resources and untapped potential offer unique opportunities for green growth and sustainable development. Therefore, they advocate for investments in renewable energy, sustainable agriculture, and green infrastructure to drive economic growth, create jobs, and mitigate the adverse effects of climate change. In his recent UNGA address, Rwandan President Paul Kagame emphasized the importance of sustainable development, stating, "Africa's future depends on our ability to embrace green growth and sustainable development models that protect our environment and promote inclusive prosperity." He called on African nations to prioritize investments in renewable energy, clean technologies, and sustainable agriculture to unlock Africa's green growth potential. African leaders view technology and innovation as essential drivers of economic growth and development in the 21st century. They argue that Africa's youthful population and growing digital connectivity offer unprecedented opportunities for innovation, entrepreneurship, and economic transformation. Therefore, they advocate for investments in digital infrastructure, education, and skills development to empower young Africans to participate in the global digital economy. President Nana Akufo-Addo of Ghana highlighted the importance of technology and innovation in his recent UNGA address, stating, "Africa's future lies in our ability to harness the power of technology and innovation to drive economic growth, create jobs, and improve livelihoods." He called on African governments and international partners to invest in digital infrastructure and skills development to unlock Africa's innovation potential and position the continent as a global leader in technology and entrepreneurship. African leaders are committed to promoting inclusive development that leaves no one behind. They argue that economic growth must be accompanied by efforts to reduce inequality, poverty, and social exclusion. Therefore, they advocate for policies and programs that prioritize the needs of marginalized and vulnerable populations, including women, youth, and persons with disabilities. In his recent UNGA address, President Uhuru Kenyatta of Kenya emphasized the importance of inclusive development, stating, "Africa's progress depends on our ability to ensure that economic growth is inclusive and benefits all segments of society." He called on African governments and international partners to prioritize education, healthcare, and social protection investments to promote inclusive development and reduce poverty and inequality. African leaders recognize the importance of rebuilding global trust and solidarity to address pressing global challenges such as climate change, pandemics, and conflict. They argue that mutual trust and cooperation are essential for building a more just, peaceful, and prosperous world. Therefore, they advocate for dialogue, diplomacy, and collaboration to overcome differences and promote shared interests and values. In his recent UNGA address, Nigerian President Muhammadu Buhari emphasized the importance of global trust and solidarity, stating, "We must work together to rebuild trust and confidence among nations and promote mutual cooperation and understanding." He called on African nations and the international community to reaffirm their commitment to multilateralism and collective action to address global challenges effectively. African leaders advocate future-oriented development strategies that significantly affect Africa's development and its relations with the international community. By prioritizing sustainable development, technology, and innovation, African leaders seek to position Africa as a global leader in the 21st century economy and promote inclusive growth and prosperity. Furthermore, by promoting global trust and solidarity, African leaders aim to foster a more just, peaceful, and prosperous world. They argue that mutual trust and cooperation are essential for addressing pressing global challenges and promoting shared interests and values. Therefore, they advocate for dialogue, diplomacy, and collaboration to effectively overcome differences and promote collective action to address global challenges. Do you think saying all this was important? Why do leaders from even powerful nations not have the courage to say all this up front? Let us know in the comments section. Will these African leaders save Africa from the West now? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.